everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Days. Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Gary Laderman. Gary is really amazing individual. I first ran into his work on the Joe Rogan podcast. Somebody sent it over. It's this concept of expanding the scope of what we think is religious behavior. Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. So Gary recently published a book called Don't Think About Death, a memoir on mortality, and really excited to check that one out when I get the opportunity. And I believe Gary is a professor at Emory, and that is correct, yes. Emory is a university in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. But yeah, Gary says it's a great fertile ground for research. So we get into that a little bit in the recording. I recorded this one ages ago. I think it was like 5 months back, maybe. Yeah, possibly like November when I was hanging out in Phoenix for a week with family. So interesting stuff. We're figuring out how to minimize our backlog here. So stay tuned. Maybe more podcasts a week, maybe. We'll see if we can handle it. Anyway, Gary is, professor at Emory, professor of religion, religious studies, and just really excited that Gary came on. I think this topic is really important to us as the psychedelic world because there's a lot of religious thinking, and we don't see it as such. We should see what's religious, what's scientific, what's purely just culture and fads, and we can understand how we're acting a little bit better if we do that. Let's not, just because we're calling it religious doesn't downplay it. But there are some mistakes that are being made because of the religious thinking. So let's see what we can do here. And let's make the best psychedelic world we can by being informed on topics like what Gary's digging into. All right. So Gary Laderman, thanks for joining us. And I hope we get to run into you again. And Gary does have a website, GaryLaderman.com. I believe there will be a podcast sooner than later, if I'm not mistaken, by Gary. So if you're taken by Gary's work, stay tuned. All right. Well, I think that's it for now on the intro. So thanks, Gary. And if you want to, so we're doing a few giveaways, psychedelicstoday.com/welcome. And there are a few different book giveaways there. I believe we have copies of Ralph Blumenthal's The Believer that we discussed at John Mack's work a few weeks ago. And I believe there's some other stuff up there too. So go check it out, sign up, share with your friends, and hopefully win some free books. And also May 20, we kick off Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. So stay tuned for that. You can learn more at psychedeliceducationcenter.com on that one. We also have Dr. Melanie Pincus teaching a serotonergic psychedelics course. She's a neuroscientist with training both at Emory and Stanford, I believe. And you can learn about that at psychedelicstoday.com under events or education. And that's maybe a 2-hour class in early May 16, maybe, if I'm not mistaken. But, don't take my word for it. Go check it out and get the dates right. And that one is available for CE, as is the Navigating Psychedelics course for clinicians and therapists, both at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. All right, everybody. We'll see you on the other side of the interview. Hope you enjoy this episode with Gary Laderman. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we were joined by Gary Laderman, professor of American Religious History and Culture at Emory University. How are you doing today, Gary?
I'm doing okay. And I'm glad to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to finally get to record with you. It's really cool to have you on the show. I was impressed with how well you negotiated the Joe Rogan interview you did. And, you were able to get some good data in there, despite the distractions.
Well, it seemed like that was ages ago. It wasn't that long ago, but an experience, that I won't soon forget for sure.
I bet. Yeah. So let's see. You have a really interesting area that you cover: sex, death, religion, and drugs. And I guess before we get into that, is there anything that kind of like really pushed you in that direction? Is there like an experience you had in college or something?
No, I mean, I wish I could. I wish I had something
Right.
scandalous or really even interesting to say. But gosh, in fact, it was really just sort of intellectual curiosity, absolutely. And what really began to draw my interest was religion and studying religion, and so as I started to pursue that, that's where these other interests came in, as I saw that there were important connections between religion and sex and death and drugs and so on.
Mm, right. And I really appreciated how you were able to frame our like a number of our cultural situations as religious. So like celebrity worship, doctor worship, the way we take certain drugs.
Right.
I've really just appreciated the hell out of
That's great. Some people don't buy it and don't appreciate it, as you can imagine. But it's just really asking people to consider the possibility that religious life extends far beyond how we normally see it in the media or think about it. It's more than the going to the church or reading the Bible. It is, as you say, these sort of cultural aspects of our lives that have religious value and meaning.
Right. It immediately, when I heard you mention that, brought up Neil Gaiman's American Gods, where all of these new weird things became gods. And they
Yeah,
had to battle it out with the old gods.
yeah,
It was
that
really interesting.
right, and certainly a recurring motif in the history of religions: old gods, new gods, and how are they tied to culture or society? What do they represent? And that's for me, that's where the action is, quite frankly, is in popular culture. That's where so much of the religious imagination is expressed, and where so much of the persuasive sort of power of media and popular culture. You can see the ways in which it has an impact on people's own sense of religious identity and kind of religious sensibilities and so on. I think it's an important data point for studying religion and identifying some of these religious dynamics in our culture.
So let's use like an example of somebody like Lady Gaga. How does that individual kind of fit in to this kind of idea?
It's funny. I'd use her videos in my religion and sexuality class, and I think they're important touchstones in some ways for 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 music fans, or for all of us, who like music, although we like different kinds of musicians. Lady Gaga is just someone who's become an icon, and whose sort of statements and persona is tied into certain kinds of values around religious identity, kind of sexual orientation, and thinking about how what kind of rules there are, or what rules don't apply when someone wants to really put out who they are and where they line up. So I think she captures that, and she taps into a certain kind of real American showmanship that entertains, but that also strikes deep in fans, people who identify with her and who can testify, as you'll see on the fan sites, to what kind of influence and transformative influence she's had in their lives. So that's one example of many you could think about.
I didn't actually even think about positive transformation here, but that's pretty valid. Like, and it's, similar to how perhaps other transformative religions would work for folks. But, for the positive and negative, right? You could see the people who get totally wrapped up in it and don't really engage in their own life anymore. And then other folks who really, have a amazing inspiration from something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think you could also say and talk about in terms of traditional religion. People who maybe get too wrapped up in their religion and lose sight of you know larger uh, community concerns or other kinds of ways of seeing or being in the world.
Mm.
So the parallels are interesting, to think through in terms of not simply how does religion function in society, but there's more going on there. I think in terms of where we focus our attention and where we want to invest our energies and time and money in ways that sort of pay off spiritually.
Mm.
And celebrities can do that, listening to Lady Gaga or going to, or whatever, back in the day, going to Grateful Dead concerts, or maybe now Fish, there's just a number of Burning Man. These are all, I think, obvious examples of tying some of this stuff together where
Mm.
you can't avoid the religious connotations of these kinds of activities.
Mm.
Just in how people describe them,
Yeah.
who go and who attend, and what they bring back from those commitments and experiences.
Right. Right. The way I talk about certain musical events is probably similar to the way certain people talk about Mecca,
Sure.
their first visit to Mecca. And
Uh,
yeah, and I keep going back, of course.
Right. I don't, I mean, this is funny but serious. I really don't
Yeah.
want to discount that and think about it in ways where we break out of some of the, again, sort of conventional conceptualizations around religion that close off a lot of what's deeply meaningful, and experiences that make an impact in the long run, of our lives.
And on the other end, we have kind of the medical profession being kind of like a high priest class. Well, I guess also university professors too, right? In a way.
Okay,
But,
yeah.
doctors and university professors, you kind of hold this high priest class in a way for culture. And it's a really interesting thing, but some people don't necessarily see that, right? It's kind of like the ideology has kind of shifted from God to something else.
I'm not sure I see that in terms of professors, doctors
Mhm.
for sure, but I wouldn't, I don't think anyone listens to professors.
Yeah, I guess in the last couple of years things have changed.
Students do, because they have to.
Right. Right. So how do we frame this thing that is medicine? So we've got these kind of priests, but we've got this kind of larger infrastructure of medicine that might be seen as the god. Or how do you like to talk about that?
I'm not so sure we have to bring God into the picture, but you
Okay.
can think in terms of symbolism and mythologies and rituals and authority. Where for me, I mean, I've looked at this historically, and particularly at the beginning of the 20th century. The rise of biomedicine, the emergence of hospitals as we know them today, right? We didn't have these kinds of hospitals in the 1800s. So, there's a whole culture that emerges in the early 20th century that, centers around the miracles of medicine and the powers and authority, especially of male white doctors, I mean, for sure. But that gets, again, not just wrapped up in some kind of pseudo religion. I think this is about life and death. This is about who has the authority to define death and to be intimate with the dying as they're passing from this life out to the next. Who is intimate with the body when we're talking about health and healing. This is a whole new religious culture again that is tied into science and new kinds of ways of thinking about medicine and health that takes hold
Mm.
and really dominates for much of the 20th century. up until, toward the end, when things really begin to, I don't know, diversify, when alternative medicines really become more mainstreamed and so on. But even so, I still think there are remnants of that worship of the medical doctor who can save me.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. That's it's a nice clean way of putting it, right? Like we've got this, sort of priest with the special clothes, and they do have the power of life and death in a lot of cases. Yeah, and saving.
Yeah,
Hmm. It might even become more of like a powerful metaphor in like the psychiatric landscape with like psychedelics as medicine, right? Where it's like a little bit less concrete. It's not like congestive heart failure. It's like this kind of softer, harder to pin down thing.
right.
Yeah, becoming slightly more magical, maybe.
Uh, right. Or we're in that, I don't know if you'd call it the honeymoon period, but, we're just kind of all so excited about psychedelics and what we're seeing in psychiatry, medicine generally, and which, if, in some sense follows a certain pattern in the history of medicine. But, on the other hand, we just are seeing things that are pretty remarkable and but that are still kind of going through this process of mainstreaming. I guess is overused, but kind of gaining legitimacy as a kind of realistic, effective, powerful therapy. And so, yeah, that's what I'm interested in. I mean, what I am interested in, as someone who studies religion and in a department of religion, is what's religious about all of this. And I think that's really exciting, fascinating, and speaks to the future of religion in America.
Hmm. And that's it. This does have to be specifically interesting to you too, because we're in some cases talking about mystical experience actually being the thing that heals. In some cases, not all of them. But that's got to be a really interesting merging of worlds for you. What does it mean now that mysticism is now medical
Yeah,
or
well,
could be medical?
exactly. And after just some of what's being published, I mean, especially with Johns Hopkins, but others who are beginning to want to recognize and then put under the microscope is a little cliche, but I mean, scientifically kind of and factor in these mystical experiences, and so that is, of course, that is fascinating and also symptomatic, in some ways of a certain way of thinking about religion and really kind of tying it into this very individual, subjective, intense, transformative experience. And mysticism, is tied in, as you know, to all kinds of ideas about universal truths around religion and different ways of understanding, are all mystical experiences kind of the same quality? How do you differentiate and sort of contextualize, how people understand mystical experiences? So, in that sense, it's we're right in the middle of it, and we're just kind of at the starting line in some ways of trying to understand how these things can kind of connect, and then what they represent, again, about our own cultural sensibilities and perspectives.
Right. Hmm. So I was trying to come up with like a clean summary of your maybe lessons for culture from the Rogan interview, and I don't think I was able to come up with anything. Do you like generally, like, say you got an opportunity to go on some mainstream news channel, like, do you have any kind of like summary you would use for that kind of a scenario to talk about, religion specifically, or like even this drug topic,
Yeah,
psychedelic topic?
well, I mean, just what I've sort of been saying and trying to emphasize religious studies, or this small little terrain that I occupy, in the universities and in the liberal arts, the study of religion as something that's not about theology or about necessarily your own personal faith, but something of interest to study. So that would be one thing. The other, of course, is simply that, as I said, that there's just more to religion than we know. And there's more to religious life than we think. And that's what I want to try to surface, get people to
Mm.
think about and maybe acknowledge in ways that, again, we're part of the moment is the rise of the nuns. That is, those people who, when asked to identify with a particular religion, claim none, right? So they don't want to claim any religious affiliation. This segment of the population is the fastest growing, if not, now the largest segment of when
Mm.
you think about religion in terms of demographics. So the spiritual but not religious crowd, the people who, don't, the people who combine multiple religions, not just in terms of interfaith families, but just in terms of their own spirituality. So the map that used to kind of work, and thinking about religion in America, I think is completely useless.
Right.
Not completely useless. I get extreme there. But for me, the action isn't with what are the Orthodox Jews doing, or what or Muslims doing in Detroit, or what are the evangelical Christians doing. I'm so tired. That someone else can study. Instead, I'm trying to understand how are drugs sacred in our lives.
Mm.
Going back to medicine, where we don't have to talk about psychedelics, or even some of the sort of notions of sacred plants, and talk about pharmaceutical culture, and
Mm.
of the ways in which we want to talk about, what ultimately matters in our lives and how we bring order and meaning, and stave off chaos and suffering. We should talk about pharmaceutical companies and prescription drugs. I mean, to me, that's like, that would be, no one has really studied that, as far as I know, from this religious studies perspective. And I think, and that's, part of what this book I'm writing is going to include, thinking about how we, rely on pharmaceutical companies and what that represents.
Right. Like they're so pictured so often as being so evil, but like the things they produce save so many lives. It's like a really interesting paradox that people have to struggle with.
Right.
Um,
And even, yeah, I mean, that's like, yeah, a religious paradox almost. Sometimes I overdo it, so if you're talking to me, it's all, everything's religious, or you tie religion into just about everything. And I do push that. But even the way, yeah, you're talking about it sort of in terms of evil, a lot of people do see it, the opioid crisis. I mean, just incredible evil. And so again, we rely on a kind of religious way of talking, or framing, especially our experiences and engagements with the prescription drugs that we all are on.
mm, right. And there's so many. It's really wild. Yeah, your discussion there of the religious nuns. I love that term now because it like evokes Catholic nuns for
Of,
me.
of course,
Whenever I say it,
hard to
I
not
just have to
to.
laugh.
I always have to
Uh,
spell it out. It's NONES.
there's this book written, published in '97 by Jeffrey Kripal called Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion.
Yes.
And I think that this idea that came out of Esalen, where it's like, I, it's kind of a sloppy idea, but it's also like a really, perhaps a more engaging idea than, religion being so cut and dry in America. It's like there's so many angles and avenues here
Yes.
for like spiritual practice that, that is explicitly spiritual. Like you're not, doing the pop culture game like we talked about, but you're looking for God kind of explicitly in a way. Yeah. And
You mean the Esalen group?
right. And that, yeah, the Esalen group. And, that kind of pervades into, in a way, probably it becomes diluted in time into where we've got kind of yoga mills
Right.
that aren't really necessarily, anything to do with spirituality
Uh,
explicitly. It's more about body.
right. And really kind of disconnected from any larger context of
Mm,
history, practice, where's this coming from? For the most part. So it's more kind of more utilitarian in some
right.
way. But yeah, Kreipel's a great guy. I know him, and he's got all
Oh,
kinds of
cool.
great books. so, and that one's, again, an important one because that is a important nexus for thinking about the American spiritual landscape. Thinking about
Right.
Esalen, Big Sur, and
Do,
all.
do you have any kind of perspective on that place?
Well, no, other than it's what you've said. It's really got an important value culturally for whatever
Mm,
is going on there. It's and I the idea mill in some ways that really spilled out quite a bit and infiltrated and shaped some of our cultural pursuits.
right. Yeah.
You
And
know.
people probably don't always get this, but it was a very important psychedelic nexus too.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
right.
Um,
And that's a big key element too when thinking about ideas of self and all that.
mm. Now, I guess before we get to death, let's talk about sex. Like, how does sex fit into this whole kind of milieu that you're working on?
A lot of the stuff is definitely tied to what I teach, and so these are all
Mm,
classes
okay.
as well chapters in the book that I wrote a little while ago called Sacred Matters, and so I have a chapter on sexuality, and I teach a class called Religion and Sexuality. So I would say first that, as should be obvious, my interest and focus is really the body.
Mm,
Because I think if you want to study religion, you want to think about the materiality of the body, and so that's where where the action is, and that's where issues of control are, and that's where ultimate matters are really located: life and death, health, birth, adulthood, rites of passage, so much. So anyway, the body, death, corpse. The body is key, and it's I think of great concern for most kind of religious cultures. So when we're talking about the body, what are we talking about? We're talking about many things, experiences, and self-understanding and identity and identifications and so on. But I think we're also, I think when you're talking about religion, you're also just sort of interested in some of the key universal aspects of our body, and sexuality is a universal aspect of what it means to be embodied. It also bears on the sacred and different ideas about how to live your life, what sort of moral codes to live by, definitely around questions of authority and religious authority in terms of, again, what you do with your body when. So those are kind of just sort of general things you could think comparatively. Most religions are going to be concerned with sexual
mm,
relations, marriage, family, orientations, and so on.
hmm
So that's what I try to focus on when just you can think about that in terms of Christianity, in terms of American cultures, in terms of Buddhism, and so on.
mm, right. I'm trying to think about how to bridge this into kind of like America today.
Well, I'd say the other thing around these realities, kind of physical bodily
Mm,
realities, is that the other thing you could say universally about them is they're contested. I mean, that's part of what's interesting about studying the sacred is that nobody agrees upon it. There's not consensus. There's always riffs and different interpretations and different kinds of perspectives. So in America today, sexuality is obviously a highly, a point of contestation and conflict, where the future of the nation is at stake around gay marriage, right? I mean, that's how the rhetoric and certainly the religious ideology kind of is framing it for many people. It's not a simple kind of question of civil rights or civil liberties. This is about sort of morality and what kind of nation are we? And so, so that's obviously one example of that. On the other hand, you can go and go on Amazon and find all kinds of books and manuals that link sex to spirituality.
Right.
I mean, whether you're working within the framework of Jewish cultures, you can find or evangelical. There's all kinds of books that try to draw connections between spiritual life and sexual practices, perspectives. You can go again from the more conventional ways of connecting those things to much more esoteric or what some might call more pornographic centric ways of thinking about how sex can be spiritual. So this is maybe at first blush, you kind of think, what are the connections? And then when you start digging and really, and then paying attention, you just see how sexuality in some form or another. I'm not just talking about, when I talk about sexuality, I'm not just talking about, getting it on or just sexual, intercourse. Sexuality is a much broader umbrella that includes the things I've mentioned, ideas about the family. How do we understand reproduction and abortion? How, what do we think in terms of identity and who we are? How do we understand gender? Are there only two genders? Are there multiple genders? Well, you take a look around at different cultures and you'll see variation. So I mean, I want to both be sensational in some way, and I think students dig that. But then also, that's the way to get them in, and then we're in all kinds of very fascinating and revealing data.
Right. I having memories from an undergrad course I took called Sexual Ethics, where the professor, the two books I recall reading were American Psycho and The Story of O, which
oh my God
was wild. That put, how old was I? 22.
Did you go to?
Plymouth State University in New Hampshire,
Right.
So right in the White Mountains.
Yeah.
It was wild. I think he was into some wild stuff, and he didn't really come out about it.
Right.
Former preacher.
Right.
But I won't say his name. I don't know if he's alive still or not.
Got it.
But it was something else to dig into just how not plastic, but diverse this topic of sexuality was.
Oh, yeah. And what I love to do in the class too with my undergrads is I ask them what they've learned about sexuality and how have they learned about it? Where is it about questions around sexuality in high school? Was it in their church? Was it at home? And there too, it's inevitable that religion comes up because, religion has the most at stake in how you socialize children and thinking about sexuality.
I think especially here in our kind of strange American culture, it's super dominant, right? Like I imagine in certain European countries where it's less dominant,
right?
It's very different.
Yes. Well, back to that, the kind of paradoxical nature that you mentioned earlier. It's like America's both sex obsessed and kind of sex wanting to control
shy
sex.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really strange. But it's a really important point. Like, if we don't examine this, like, what are we doing by not examining it?
Yeah, we're kind of being led by scripts that have been written, and that that keep us tracked in some sense. And so I kind of want to break that for sure. And like I'm able to do that I hope to some degree in the classroom.
Mm,
But then getting out on a place like Joe Rogan is a whole other level.
right. Like, I imagine when your next book comes out, you'll be able to influence more people because of that. I would hope, at least. Um,
Well, I you never know for sure on that. I'm in some sense, I mean, I write for myself,
mm,
so what comes after that is what it is.
right. That's a nice attitude to have about it. Sure. Many people have been crushed for not having as much of an impact as they wanted.
Mm.
So
Try not to get sucked into that.
it's good. It's good. Yeah. And this Terrence McKenna quote's coming up for me, and I'm just kind of want you to kind of respond to it, as you would with Terrence if he was in the room or something. But like this idea that culture isn't your friend, culture is not your friend, and if you're not working on your thing, you're working on somebody else's thing. That's a paraphrase. So if you don't
Mhm.
have your own plan, you're part of somebody else's, I think was the more close. And this kind
Right.
of seems like it's rhyming a bit with this sexual programming kind of discussion.
That's an interesting point because I guess instead of either or, maybe it's both and in the sense of, on the one hand, yeah, you just don't want to be an automaton or just, you're just kind of running by the scripts that culture gives us. But on the other hand, culture is an important resource for making sense of the world and again, sort of coping and living through it all. And I don't know, I don't know if I would agree that it makes culture the enemy in some sense. It's some kind of weird dance and give and take or something. But I mean, especially we may be getting to this in a little bit, but I'm thinking about death and how people are responding to death, and what are the cultural resources? When especially in a pandemic, when the older scripts are like out the window, regardless, of what we want. And so there too, so popular culture, certain kinds of cultures can be very empowering and meaningful in living.
Mm, yeah.
Would he agree with that, you think? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, who knows with that guy?
Well,
I don't
I mean,
necessarily know how coherent he was all the
I don't
time,
know.
but
Well,
there's
I
always
know.
gems.
I know.
Yeah. But yeah, like there's something about survival with culture. Like having a nice ordered culture helps you survive, kind
Oh,
of.
oh, yeah.
but it doesn't necessarily help you thrive. I think that's perhaps like the balance. And how do you even define thriving? That's going to be really potentially a subjective thing, though you could have some objective measures.
Sure.
Yeah. Like the Story of O just popped in. Like if that was what success was in Story of O, like that, it's pretty wild. Like it's very different from what
Right.
we might perceive as success in
Yeah.
our modern culture, right?
Right. And yeah, and then also just to think the influence of the teacher
Mm,
making
hmm.
those choices.
Yeah.
But that's part of it too. Our education is not limited to what we get in the classroom.
Hmm. Right. There's kind of like that horizontal peer education around
Right.
sex that happens probably more
Oh,
regularly than like a formal education being helpful for folks.
yeah. Well, and now in ways I'm sure I don't even understand or get or am anywhere near, but certainly with social media and thinking
Right.
how whatever young people, oh God, young people are, how are they learning? What are they learning? Again,
Right.
the notion of education, socialization that's outside of the teacher in the classroom, around death, around sexuality, around drugs. Again, these are just great topics for because we're all in one way or another. We're all there with those particular topics.
Right. I'm a little bit aware when I'm doing this show that there's going to be some folks, probably a fair amount of folks under 18 listening. But I wonder if other people are aware. Like I'm not necessarily trying to make a safe message for a 7-year-old, but are people considering like what is a safe message for a 15-year-old or 14-year-old to hear? Like, that I think that's why I focus on harm reduction a lot. But like if you go to some of these sites, like or even YouTube, people are doing like 5 drugs live on camera at once. And it's like, what on earth? Like
Exactly. And it's tricky to try to monitor and control that and not be seen as conservative. I think that you can just talk about our culture and how it's changed over the last several decades, and social media is certainly in part puts it all out there, and how that's policed or monitored or whatever is still, I don't think no one knows exactly. And it is so influential. It is so powerful as a cultural force in shaping people's values and what aspirations, what they think they ought to be doing, what they want to be doing, even though they shouldn't be doing it. It's just crazy. And I'm not a condemner. I'm not like, oh, this is terrible. I mean, it is what it is, and I try
right.
to I try to study it. But I hear what you're saying though about the kind of conscientiousness that you have. Again, some others have for sure, but maybe it might be too harsh to say. But I think overall, most people are not concerned.
Right. Yeah. So, another angle, not psychedelic necessarily, but, our like kids are certainly learning about drugs online. They're, learning about sex from porn stars. They're learning, or,
Yeah,
their local
yeah.
TikTok celebrity or whatever. And yeah, like what does that mean? And like, is it necessarily the case that it's bad? Like I have a really hard time with these value judgments, good and bad. And yeah, like how do we as a culture, like, I'm starting to think America's kind of like too big to have, like, can we as a culture agree on something? Like,
Right, right.
yeah.
That's the challenge too, is especially around questions of morality.
Mm,
We are coming out of I'm going to just put it out there. I think. I mean, we're coming out of what has been, well, for most of, I would say, most of the history of the nation, a pretty strong and solid Christian dominance,
right.
and that. Again, making some overgeneralizations, but that really begins to break down in the 60s. And there obviously are different kinds of pendulum swings and cultural forces at work in the 70s, 80s, and into the century. But part of what the sort of, I think, the tumultuous nature of what we're living through now, forgetting about this, the pandemic, is that sense of, I would use this term, even though some people may not like it, of the sense of de-Christianization,
Mm,
right? And so that's different than secularization, right? The de-Christianization is sort of looking at the ways in which Christianity is becoming less and less influential in a kind of larger sense
mm,
in American society. And that means there are all kinds of other religious forces and cultures that are emerging and that are drawing people in that are no longer so squarely in that larger box of Christianity. Back to the nuns and the spiritual but not
mm,
religious, kind of seeing that take place. And so, where are the religious authorities? Where are the religious authorities for, understanding the meaning of death? You know,
mm.
if there's an afterlife,
Mm-hmm.
or whether or not I should take a drug to have a mystical experience, or all kinds of questions. And so who do you turn to when those traditional authority figures that, again, tied to Christianity or Christians who were various kinds of community political leaders are no longer holding the sway they had, and especially on young people? Where do then sort of where do you go? And here's where I'm saying popular culture, entertainers, celebrities, therapists. There's just a variety of other kinds of religious sources that provide answers to the questions that we, I think, at some level, all struggle with.
Mm. Yeah.
Why is there suffering? How do I increase the pleasure in my life? What does it? What do experiences of ecstasy mean? How do I understand those? What does it mean to age? Those kinds of things. Again, to go back, it's an interesting time in American society, for all kinds of reasons, and at the moment, in ways that are scaring the hell out of me. But again, stepping back and thinking about the religious landscape, the kind of place and solidity of Christianity, even in its various Catholic and Protestant forms,
Mm.
seems very fragmented and less influential, less relevant. Even though, again, this is still in a time of very real and volatile kind of religion and politics, arguments and debates.
Mm. Are you seeing any kind of interesting angles with this kind of psychedelic resurgence, with research and centers popping up everywhere, underground religions and underground groups popping up all over? Like, what are some of the more interesting things in the psychedelic landscape for you as a researcher and professor?
Uh, at the moment, and what I'm most thinking about is how to tie in this religious angle to what is happening, and is really becoming a major phenomenon that isn't about the mystical experience. I mean, that's important, and so as we talked about, that's kind of being factored in. But instead, I want to try to bring psychedelics into a larger discussion around, again, the questions we were just pursuing. It's a sort of where do Americans turn for religious support and for religious resources that can help get through life, and that can help make sense of life, and that
Mm.
can help bring order and stability to life, as well as to provide pathways or ways to break out of the ordinary and to experience something profound and extraordinary. So psychedelics are doing all that, and I think more and more they're going to be doing that via or in some kind of interesting combination with the sort of language and cultures of therapy and medicine.
Mm. Right. Huh. I find it really interesting. This, even just the term religion, like people really get uncomfortable around it in the psychedelic space when some of the ideas are explicitly religious, but people seem to refuse to accept that, or just don't want to think that these kinds of religious ideas that you would see in perhaps like a mushroom or an ayahuasca space are, have any relation whatsoever to, church that people would be going to in, their parents' generation, right? Like
Right.
there's this weird discontinuity.
Yeah. That's the problem with language,
Mm.
and words. Sometimes these words have so much baggage, and there isn't really a useful or acceptable substitute. You're kind of stuck with the word, but you want to break out of of how people think about it. And that's my jive. That's what I'm after is, in part being sacrilegious, kind of to get people to really question their assumptions about religion and how we think about it.
Mm.
So I understand that, and believe me, I've encountered that, especially because I try to make everything religion or find, religious, valences and all kinds of different aspects of culture, and people resist that, and I understand that. On the other hand, I think you could hopefully in a conversation make arguments that bring in what we commonly associate with religion or religious life, as I mentioned before. Not necessarily God or some kind of substance, but these signposts that kind of indicate there's a religious action going on. Things like ritual, things like myth, things like transcendence,
Yeah.
things like identity. All of these, again, sort of what we normally would say, the church deals with those things are now no longer confined to the church. The answers, and the activities around, again, those topics are no longer, their meanings and associations and power are no longer simply or only defined by what the preacher says or what the rabbi says or whatever.
Mm. This might be the hardest question. I wish I didn't save it till the end. But let's see what we can do here. And it's okay if we don't do well. But we kind of hinted at this earlier on mystical experience and, say, somebody at a dead show on 10 hits of acid, or somebody at a Hopkins clinical trial where they're trying to push mystical experiences, or perhaps in comparing those to somebody like a lifelong Kabbalist at age like 75 who's, spent years and years doing spiritual work. Like, so this is something that's been coming up in my world. Like, how do we compare those two things? Or like, is there a way to or is, the Kabbalist experience identical to the psychedelic user who's only in their first couple years of exploration? I'm sure you've kind of thought
Yeah.
about this once in a while, but I know it's kind of really weird and complicated.
Well, yeah, and we've brought it up. I mean, it's not unheard of when you think about religion and all these different religions, and then maybe they all actually share certain things in common. Very perennialist kind of perspective. And I mean, you're asking me. For me, I'm all about comparative studies. I think that's key, and that's the whole sort of logic, I would say, of my classes, and even the sort of the books, is to think and across cultures and try to, at least, even if it's in some sense superficial or a kind of glancing connection, to sort of think broadly about death. I can't understand death in America unless I kind of think about death in Africa or death in India. And that helps to kind of refine and
Right. You need a comparative touch point.
right. That just helps. Yeah. And that just helps to kind of keep you in check and then kind of see what's unique and what might be similar. So, that's, I think, important. But on the other hand, it's all context. I'm a historian. And so I don't see that they're identical.
Right.
And then this is my own also little, I say this in class too. It's my own little bias, I guess, as a scholar or whatever, someone who studies religion, is I'm not interested in an individual's subjective personal experience. Right? I'm just only interested in the social and sort of cultural, and not getting inside that interior space of the experience. I mean, and again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not my training and where my attention goes.
And I think that's helpful, right? It's, if we don't have that perspective as like a foundation, we're kind of missing some big things.
You mean the interior?
Well, both. Like we need that social kind of history, and we need to be able to compare things to different cultures across time and space.
Right.
Yeah, like context is really important.
Right. And then again, also just thinking about people, how they describe certain mystical experiences, or what are the common themes, and
Mm.
that too is important and revealing as well. So it's, as you say, there's a balance there, absolutely. But I mean, for me, I try to stay away from those sort of more um, questions about the sort of ultimate meanings of some of these experiences, or if they tie into or tap into something that's, as they say, really real. And I'm too confused by all the mysteries in life to feel like I am in any position to sort of really take a stand there.
No, I appreciate that about your perspective. It's like real intellectual honesty. And I think intellectual honesty is sometimes missing in this space.
Oh, in the psychedelic space.
Right, right, right. In the psychedelic space. Probably also everywhere else too, but
Well, right.
this
Well, I'm
is
afraid so. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, but I mean, yeah, I mean, it's just this is, I'm coming at this from a very specific background. You know,
mhm.
studying religion, thinking about religious studies, and very much interested in the body, and sort of the body in space and in connection with other bodies, and thinking about, again, sort of more of the social dynamics of this flourishing of interest in psychedelics. It's, as I said, I think it taps into a larger cultural shift or transformation that's taking place. That's pretty exciting, intellectually, but also I think just someone living through it.
Mm. Mhm. Are there any projects in particular in the psychedelic space that you're most excited about, or might want to know more about? And you take that as broadly as you want.
Well, you mean of research and things that are going on now,
Or it could
or
be cultural experiments or anything that's really happening now in psychedelia generally. From above ground to underground.
yeah, I'm kind of more, and became much more fascinated. Again, the pandemic kind of threw everything off, but with that subcultural element,
Mm.
especially someone here in Atlanta, Georgia, where the stuff is not out there and public in the way we now we know it is in Oregon, California, and Colorado, and so on. So as I've been doing research for the book on religion and drugs, which is not exclusively on psychedelics, but obviously that's a big part. That will be a big part of it. Is learning about, again, this just sort of network of subculture psychedelic communities everywhere. I mean, it's incredible how widespread they are. And so just thinking about that, on the one hand, you have the very public medical studies and Hopkins and Berkeley, centers that are studying this and legitimizing it. And then, on the other hand, you have this undercurrent of well, what do we say, less intellectual, well, I'm assuming less intellectual pursuits in terms of the study of, but instead, again, sort of this underground world of let's trip. And I don't think I just mean that recreationally, but it's just a whole other level in America of activity where I think there's something religious going on in those subcultural connections.
Have you heard of this concept of eternal September?
No.
So it comes out of like the Usenet world, so pre AOL internet, I guess. And in September '93, AOL started offering Usenet access to many users, kind of overwhelming the existing culture for online forums. And there's just this kind of exponential growth that diluted the culture in really interesting ways. So you had this really strong Usenet culture, and then all of a sudden, there's 500x more people in there that didn't have that same experience set coming in.
Right.
And I think this is going to be a really interesting phenomena in psychedelics that, we're kind of in the middle of it, but so many people are coming in that
Yeah.
the existing cultural structures are getting kind of overwhelmed and freaking out. I think that's going to be a really interesting phenomenon to look at.
That's a great analogy, and I mean, I see exactly what you're getting at, and because I agree, it's going to be a huge, I think, outpouring of interest and public willingness to try this. And then what does that mean in terms of how that's all worked out? But also, obviously, another angle too would be just pharmaceutical involvement and how
Mm-hmm.
what future that you know how that will look in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. Do you see any kind of cultural comparisons to these kind of quasi illegal psychedelic religions to like past historical situations?
It's hard to think of what might connect with it. I think just because of the nature of American society to some degree, and the place and kind of uniqueness of drugs in American and modern history. So it's very, I think, in some ways unique. You could certainly look at maybe the use of coffee
Mm,
in different communities in the Islamic world. We
right. Super popular. Then it got pushed back, but the
Well,
people
not
never
that. I was thinking more as just sort of was more on sort of the margins in some sense, and had kind of value for a more marginal elements in that community. But then again, it becomes something that's quite over time. Kind of becomes a integral part of the culture. Again, a kind of psychoactive substance that's both seen as dangerous and empowering. Thinking about the history of coffee, but other than that, I guess I would have to think through that. I'm not sure. Nothing comes to
right.
mind.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting topic for sure. But yeah, there's a lot there to simmer on.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you were able to identify some underground stuff in Georgia in your research.
Well, I learned about it especially after Joe Rogan,
Mm-hmm.
but before that, I mean, I was much more kind of tuned in. I went to Austin and did some interviews there, and I also spoke to some people who were in Washington D.C.
Mm,
and then just kind of going online and being able to see and find the activity is also pretty indicative of how strong this is at the moment.
mm, yeah. Right. I lived in Park City, Utah for a minute, and it was really interesting being in a heavily kind of Mormon dominated culture, but seeing how strong the counterculture was as a response to that.
Right.
So I think we're always going to see stuff like that. And there's this church in Orlando now, an ayahuasca church. I think they go by Soul Quest, maybe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and they've got billboards on the highway, from what I understand.
Yeah.
And that's a fascinating
Again,
situation there.
right. And again, it's this is going to be I imagine a site of contestation, and of
Mm,
conflict around questions of legitimacy. You know,
right.
it's what is America willing to accept? But I agree, but and certainly some legal cases have turned in more favorable directions and kind of expanding out religious practice to a degree.
Yeah. From what I understand, they're probably going to win their lawsuit against the DEA for the DEA just kind of holding on to their application for extra long
Yeah,
for an exclusion. So that would be a really interesting thing. A third U.S. ayahuasca church
that's right. I mean, yeah,
with
it's
federal protection.
right. and who are the members, and all of that, and it's certainly going to be something to watch, because that's so, new to the, at some level, to the American landscape or American public consciousness until fairly recently. But it's, as you know, its popularity has just flared up and exploded in the last decade or so.
Right.
And how is that going to play out here? And there too, what are drugs and what are their relationship to, to religion and religious life?
Mm-hmm.
This gets right, kind of front and center, kind of like wine, in the Eucharist, if you want to talk about drugs more broadly, or peyote,
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So that there's something there, and thinking about, again, some kind of psychoactive alteration,
Right.
and something deep in terms of religious yearning and grasping and seeking,
Mm.
and ways to, stabilize the ritual of consumption. Is just as important as the experience.
Mm.
Maybe.
I think you got something there.
I'm putting
Totally.
it out there again, for thinking about the religious side of this.
Yeah.
And some of the religious signs and some of these activities, and how they impact people's lives.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've been recording for a bit over an hour, and I want to give you a little bit of time to talk about your existing available books and what you're kind of working on publishing.
Oh, thanks. That was already an hour. Longer. I just had a book that's just out called "Don't Think About Death," a memoir on mortality. So I've written a few books on the history of death in America, and this one's a bit more personal. So that's just out, and so I've also mentioned the book "Sacred Matters" that looks at celebrity worship, sexual ecstasies, the living dead, and other signs of religious life in modern America. That's the title. And then the other thing that I'm trying to get to and work through is this new project on religion and drugs that is thinking drugs, drugs in broader terms than just psychedelics, thinking about the role of psychoactive drugs in our religious lives, and how I think, as I've alluded to already, this is in some ways the future of religion in America. Is our connections with and reliance on psychoactive substances that can help in a variety of ways, including religious and spiritual ways.
Mm.
And I'm teaching a couple classes too. That's what I got coming up immediately.
Right.
A death and dying class, and then an American religious history class.
Is this mainly focused on Emory students?
Well, yes. That's at the moment all I'm doing.
Right. If you're writing books and teaching classes, it's kind of enough.
Well, right. And it's just at Emory. I also recently started my own podcast called Sacrilegious, which I hope will be a lot of fun, but also will try to look at religion in a very different way, and how people are religious in ways they may not recognize.
It's super interesting. Great. Cool. Anything else you want to mention? words of wisdom for some of these psychonauts lost at sea?
Hey, well, we're all sort of lost at sea these days, I would say, but let's hope find some shore to settle on at some point. I mean, no, this has been great. I mean, you're great to talk with, and love the questions, and hope we get a chance to do it again sometime.
Yeah, I really do hope so, Gary. Thanks for being here, and until next time.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to you.
And there you have it, everybody. Professor Gary Laderman of Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. I hope y'all liked that one. It's a real thinker for me. And really spun me in some interesting directions for a few months. So hope you all enjoyed it. And hope you'll tune in for more and maybe check out more of Gary's work, either in online video form or in book form. His book is out now. Don't Think About Death, a memoir on mortality. So check that one out. He's got all sorts of great media on his website at GaryLaderman.com. So please do check it out. Again, we have some book giveaways going at psychedelicstoday.com/welcome. So you can find those there. And we're giving away copies of Ralph Blumenthal's The Believer, beautiful book about John Mack, the pioneering and very important Harvard psychiatrist. And we think you should dig in. And May 20, we kick off Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. It is CE available. It's an amazing 45 to, I think 47 hours is the number I've been using. 47-hour total training. And it's largely foundations. Some folks want to teach you how to do the work right away. We think you probably deserve an amazing foundation, theoretical, with a bunch of practical as well, before you go deep. And this should help those looking to get more deeply involved in the field a good foothold. We've been told it's getting people jobs and into schools. So if you want to just keep on getting educated and keep building up your credibility, come on down, psychedelicEducationCenter.com, and you can learn more about our programs there. And there is also this serotonergic psychedelics course with Dr. Melanie Pincus, neuroscientist with training at Emory. And you can learn about that at psychedelicstoday.com under events. And CE available. All right, I think that's enough. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you next time. This is Joe Moore signing off from Psychedelics Today in Breckenridge, Colorado. Bye-bye.